In regards to the psukim of Vayider Yaakov Neder Lamer, Yaakov makes a vow saying, that if Hashem is going to be with me, Hashem will be my God, and this stone that I have placed as a monument here, Beis Elikim, will be a place for Hashem where I'll offer karbonos. The Mefarshim ask, how can we understand this idea that Yaakov seems to be saying that his good deeds are going to depend on a condition? He's saying, these things that I'm going to make, the stone as a monument, and then I'm going to give meiser, etc., as if there's some sort of condition. If Hashem will be with me, then I'll do these things. Chas v'sholem, is Yaakov Avinu serving Hashem only to get some sort of gain, some sort of reward? This itself tells us that when Yaakov is connecting his neder, when Yaakov is connecting his vow, his maisim tovim, with some sort of condition, Yaakov does not mean that the goal is that he wants to have these things, that he's making a condition, and in order to get them, he's making this vow, he's making this neder, to do the good deeds. But rather it's the other way around. The whole purpose is that he wants to fulfill the vow. He wants to do these good deeds. And the fact that he's putting some conditions, saying, if Hashem will be with me, is basically saying that the way I will be able to do this neder, to fulfill this vow, is if I have certain conditions met, then I'll be able to practically go ahead and do those things. In order to understand this, says the Rebbe, we're first going to have a look at the actual tenaya, the actual condition that Yaakov is making, and the neder. That there's two ways of looking at it. The Rebbe first looks at Rashi and then at the Ramban. Rashi says that the condition includes and finishes off with the words V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim, and Hashem will be my Eibishter, which is the end of a pasuk, which Rashi explains as meaning that Hashem will be my God and my children's God. He will find my children fit. In other words, Hashem will apply His name to myself and my children. If that's all going to happen, then the next pasuk starts off with the neder, with the vow, which is V'ha'even hazois, that this stone that I have placed as a monument will be a Beis Elikim, etc. On the other hand, the Ramban learns that these words V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim, which is at the end of the previous pasuk, is not as a continuation of the condition, which is the way Rashi explained it, but rather this is already the beginning of the fulfillment of the vow. In other words, the Tanai, the condition finished with the words, where Yaakov was saying that I'll return home to my father's house, and then the next words, V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim, that's already part of what he's saying he's going to do. That's already part of the fulfillment of the vow. Says the Rebbe, we need to understand, according to the Ramban, since V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim is the beginning already of his vow, in other words, we finished with the condition before, and now this is the first words of the vow. So the way the psukim should have been divided is that V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim shouldn't have been the end of the previous pasuk, where speaking about all the things of the condition that Yaakov Avinu is asking for all the different things for Hashem to protect him, and finally that he's going to come home in peace. But rather it should have been part of the next pasuk, which starts off with the other things that Yaakov is promising, that V'ha'even hazois, that the stone is going to be a Beis Elikim, about his neder. Especially, says the Rebbe, that according to the Ramban, V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim is not only connected to the words V'ha'even hazois, a Beis Elikim, because they're both part of the neder, but rather, according to the Ramban, they're actually part of the same sentence. They're part of the same idea. The Ramban says, V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim means I'm going to serve Hashem in the place of this stone that's going to be my Beis Elikim. So certainly the words V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim should be together with the words V'ha'even hazois. So we must say that according to the Ramban, these words V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim, although on the one hand, yes, the Ramban is saying it's part already of Yaakov's promise, Yaakov's vow, Yaakov's neder, but to a certain degree, in a certain detail at least, it is even more connected with the condition that was spoken about earlier, of V'shavti b'shalom, rather than being connected to the promise of V'ha'even hazois. In other words, even though, yes, it is part of the neder, part of the promise, but to a certain extent, it's more shaykh to the previous pasuk, part of the condition. And that's why V'hoya Hashem li le'elikim and V'shavti el Beis Avi are in the same pasuk. Now the Rebbe looks at, we just looked at the neder, how they are divided in two psukim. According to the Ramban, that is, because V'hoya Hashem Lila Likim is one pasuk, and the next pasuk is V'evan Azois. And what we're going to see is that it's two different categories within the neder itself. So too, says the Rebbe, in regards to the condition that Yaakov makes, they're also divided into two psukim. One pasuk says, "Im yiyeh lekimi madi," if Hashem will be with me, and He's going to protect me, and He's going to give me food to eat and clothes to wear, and so on. Then the next pasuk says, again, still part of the condition, "V'shavti b'shalom el beis avi," and I'll return in peace to my father's house. Now, according to Rashi, the next few words of that pasuk is still part of the condition. V'hoya Hashem lila likim. But definitely we have two psukim regarding the condition. According to Rashi, the full second pasuk is the condition. According to Ramban, it's only part of the pasuk. So it's again because here too there are going to be two categories within the condition. Excuse me. Says the Rebbe, this is emphasized also in the wording of the pasuk. In the first pasuk, in other words, to see that there's a difference between these two parts of the condition. In the first pasuk, it's all speaking about what Hashem is going to do. Im kimi madi, that Hashem will be with me. Yishmarani, He's going to protect me. He's going to give me food and clothes, etc. In the next pasuk, where it says V'shavti, and I will return, it doesn't say V'heshivani, that Hashem will return me. It almost sounds like this is already something that Yaakov is doing. V'shavti, I will return to my father's house. So we see clearly that there's two different aspects within the Tanai, within the conditions that Yaakov is asking for, or he's saying is going to happen. There's also two categories. Says the Rebbe, the Nekudas Habir in all of this is Yaakov Avinu's descent going down to Chutz La'aretz, coming from Be'er Shava, from Eretz Yisrael, going to Chutz La'aretz, especially a place like Charon, which as Rashi tells us elsewhere is Charoin Afshal Mokim Boilam, it's Hashem's anger in the world, was obviously, as Chassidus explains, you read the Tzoyrech Aliyah. It was in order to have a greater ascent. Now within this Aliyah, what's being achieved through Yaakov's descent, there's three aspects, there's three ideas. Number one, the fact that while he's in Charon, in Beis Lavan, he's not being influenced, he's not being affected of the people over there, and he comes out sholei menachet, complete from sin, in other words, not being impacted in any way. Yaakov was elevated to a greater level than he was before the descent. Says the Rebbe, this is similar to, although not exactly the same, but it's similar to what we speak in other places about the Maila, about the advantage of a Baal Tshuva over a Tzaddik. We say Makom Shebali Tshuva, the place that Bali Tshuva stands, Tzaddikim Gemurim cannot stand over there. And what's the reason for that? Because a Baal Tshuva had already tasted something of the taste of sin, and yet he separated from the sin. He overcame his Yetzer Hara. In a similar way, we're saying over here that Yaakov Avinu was able to withstand all these challenges in the house of Lavan. Then there's a second aspect. The Yaakov Avinu, this is the place where he marries. He fulfills the mitzvah of Pru Ravu, taking over the world of Chivshua, conquering, etc., as it says regarding Pru Ravu. So Yaakov Avinu is told to take, by his father, that he should take a wife over there, and Hashem will multiply him, etc. And furthermore, mitase shleima, that all of his children are tzaddikim. So this is a second thing, that's the aliyah that Yaakov Avinu is gaining by going to Charon. And finally, point number 3, in the language of Chassidus, that through the avodah with Tzoyin Lavan, through the avodah with the sheep of Lavan, over 20 years, he was mevared, he was elevating, he was refining, taking the sparks of Kedusha that were in the Tzoyin Lavan, in the sheep of Lavan. And that again brings out a certain iluy, a certain quality, and brings an advantage to Yaakov Avinu. It says, Vayifrei tzoish ma'od ma'od. How specifically as a result of this, he becomes very rich, very wealthy, spreading out in all directions, which is again, of course, when we're speaking Baruchnius, it means there was a tremendous aliyah in Yaakov Avinu as a result of these sparks that he elevated. Says the Rebbe, we know that Maisa is similar bonim, and it's understood that this idea of Yaakov going from Be'er Shava to Charon is also in the avodah of each and every individual. In fact, the Oirach Chaim explains that this pasuk is hinting to the general descent of a neshama coming down here into this world, as well as the descent of Yidden going into Golus, which, as we know, again, the concept of Yerida, Tzoyrech Aliyah, the whole purpose of the descent, is all for the ascent. And here again, we have these same 3 ideas, similar to the Aliyah of Yaakov Avinu. Number 1, the neshama, when it was up above, before coming down, is on the level of a tzaddik. And as a result of coming down, clothing itself in a guf, in a nefesh bahamis, which are concealing, which are blocking ungodliness, and nevertheless, it does its avodah in Torah and mitzvahs. So now it gets this mila of like a Baal Tshuva, like the pasuk says, "V'ruach toshuv el ha'elikim," that the spirit, the neshama goes back to Hashem, but in a way of a Baal Tshuva, greater than the avodah of a tzaddik. Number two, when it comes down here, so it's able to fulfill the mitzvah of pruruvu of having children are really Torah and mitzvahs in general, similar to Yaakov Avinu. And number three, through its avodah in the physical things, and this would be similar to Yaakov Avinu with the sheep of Lavan. So it's in its avodah in the physical things, he's accomplishing that the world should become a place for Hashem, a dira lo yisbarich, as we know, a dira b'tachtoinim. And through this, again, the neshama is being elevated to a much higher and greater level than it ever was before. Just to point out, before continuing the Sicha, that although the Rebbe mentioned over here three general ideas, the main focus, it seems like, is going to be more the first and the third idea. The first one, again, being the fact that notwithstanding all the challenges, it still stays strong in its avodah. And the third one being the fact that we're actually taking the world and changing it into a place for Hashem. In other words, not only about the neshama standing strong and not being affected by the world, but in fact, transforming the world. That seems to be the focus of the next part of the Sicha. Says the Rebbe, regarding this idea that we just mentioned, of that we're making the world, the tachtoinim, into a place for Hashem, a dira lo yisbarich, and that the aliyahs haneshama that happens through this is, as we know, because, in other words, the Zaliyas HaNeshama that happens as a result of making the world a place for Hashem. Says the Rebbe, in a certain aspect, in a certain regard, there's a certain advantage when we deal with the type of avodah, which we call V'chol Ma'asecha L'Shem Shamayim, and B'chol Drachecha Do'eyu, that means dealing with the regular, ordinary, mundane things of the world and just doing them for the sake of Hashem. In a certain extent, it's even more than in Limud HaTorah and Kiyum HaMitzvahs. Because when we take even these simple, weekday, mundane things, ordinary things, ma'asecha and drachecha of the person, and we make them l'shem shamayim, and we make them do'eyu, so then the dira betachtoinim for Hashem is mamish in the lowest of the lowest things. We're not even dealing with things of kedusha. We're dealing with ordinary, everyday things. Says the Rebbe, just like we say that there's a certain advantage when we're dealing with the inyoni reshus, with the mundane things, compared to the avodah of Torah and mitzvahs, in regards to this milah that we just said in the dira b'tachtoinim aspect, so too there's a certain advantage, specifically in the Inyani Harashus, when we go back to the first point that we were mentioning about the person standing strong despite all the challenges, which is the idea that we said that the neshama comes to the milah of like a Baal Tshuva. So here too we're going to see a specific milah, dafka, when he's dealing with the lowliest of the low. And that is, when a yid is doing a mitzvah, even when the Kiyum HaMitzvah was in a way that he had to overcome his Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara was trying to stop him and block him from doing the mitzvah, and he overcame it, and he does the mitzvah. Nevertheless, since after he got himself to do the mitzvah, he weakened his Yetzer Hara, and now it was revealed his true Ratzon, that every Yid deep down inside wants to do all the mitzvah, says the Rambam tells us. So what ends up happening is that the fulfillment of the mitzvah itself, while he's doing the mitzvah, the Yetzer Hara has no connection to this. It was sort of, despite the Yetzer Hara, he conquered his Yetzer Hara, he pushed the Yetzer Hara out of the way, and he did the mitzvah. And therefore, the mitzvah itself is not mamish in a way of the Baal Tshuva. The mitzvah itself was like the tzaddik. What was revealed is the tzaddik inside of him. He pushed away the Yetzer Hara. Whereas when we speak about the avodah of b'chol drachecha de'el l'chol masechel l'shem shamayim, since when we're doing these in Yoni Arishus, it's coming from, why am I doing these mundane things? So the Rebbe doesn't give an example over here, but the Rebbe speaks about mundane things. Let's just use the example of eating for a moment. So the Rebbe says, since we're doing it, because by nature I have a desire for these things, that's the kiyum of the guf, that's the chayis, that's the existence, the life of the body, because of his nefesh ha'amis. In fact, says the Rebbe, that's why even when we're doing them l'shem shamayim, and even when we're doing them in a way of da'eh, we're still calling it ma'asecha, it's still your actions. It wasn't a mitzvah, it's still called drachecha, your ways. So when we do these things of inyani or reshus of mundane things l'shem shamayim or in a way of da'ehu, that means the action itself is in a way of Baal Tshuva. Again, When we speak about, just to summarize, when we speak about the doing of the mitzvah, so yes, what led to it was that I needed to get the Yetzer Hara out of the way. But in the action itself, in the mitzvah itself, the Yetzer Hara wasn't involved. When I'm speaking about that means I'm doing the physical action, so I have my nefesh ba'amis is teva. The teva of my nefesh ba'amis is getting me to want to eat, for example, but I'm eating that food itself. The action itself that I'm doing is now being utilized l'shem shamayim. The Rebbe goes to explain it a little bit more in detail, this specific mila of the tshuva aspect that happens in this avodah b'chol derech chol masechel l'shem shamayim, compared to the tshuva aspect, where I'm just holding back my Yetzer Hara and going ahead and doing Torah and mitzvahs. And the Rebbe explains, generally, what is the mila of tshuva over the avodah of a tzaddik? So we understand, in the avodah of tshuva in the literal sense, we understand that tshuva brings out the real strong hiskashrus of a yid with Hashem. That's what tshuva is all about. In other words, what tshuva is telling me is that the hiskashrus, the bond between a yid and Hashem, is never lost, even through an aveira. And that's why even no matter what a yid did, even he did aveiros, he could still do tshuva. That's tshuva in the literal sense. Now let's apply this to tshuva in the fact that the neshama comes down lamata, and that this is going to, because it comes down lamata, that's revealing the strength of the iskashus of the neshama with Hashem. The same idea, that even when it came down into a guf, into a nefesh habahamis, into a Yetzer Hara, nevertheless it stands strong, it does its avodas Hashem. But says the Rebbe, now we'll understand that the tshuva, this level of tshuva that's reached when we're involved in Yoni Harishus and mundane things, l'shem shamayim, why that's greater compared to the tshuva that is in the avoid of Torah and mitzvahs. In the avoid of Torah and mitzvahs, that strength of the neshama is mainly being expressed in the fact that the yid was able to overcome his guf and nefesh habahamis, go out of their from their rulership. He was able to weaken them and do his avodah. However, when he's doing these in Yoni Rishus, the mundane things, and he's doing them l'shem shamayim, so that's bringing out a much deeper iskashros. In other words, he's being connected with the Eibishter, even within the things where the desire of the nefesh habahamis and the guf are being felt. Again, let's use the example of the hunger. I feel my hunger, I'm eating because of my hunger, and even in there, I'm feeling my connection to the Eibishter. Says the Rebbe, after all of this, nevertheless, even this advantage, even this special level that the neshama reaches of tshuva, which happens through doing all of his Yoni Rishus l'shem shamayim, still, this is not in any way similar to or compared to the mila that the neshama has by making the world into a dira for Hashem. Again, just let's go back and summarize some of the main points that we said until now. Again, the Rebbe looked at two, although there was three originally, but the Rebbe was looking at two main things that happen as a result of the neshama coming into this world. And Yaakov going down to Choron. We were speaking about one aspect, is the fact that he overcomes the challenges. And here the Rebbe looked at two ways within this itself, whether it's in the avodah of Torah and mitzvahs or in the avodah of l'shem shamayim. And then the Rebbe said, there's also another advantage that comes as a result of coming down into this world, and that's the fact that we're going to make the world a place for Hashem. In other words, nothing to do with our overcoming our challenges, but the idea itself that we're making the world a place for Hashem. So now the Rebbe is looking at this idea of making the place a world for Hashem, why this is still going to be greater no matter all of these aliyahs that the neshama came to by overcoming his Yetzer Hara. And the Rebbe says like this, one of the explanations is, the connection of the neshama to Hashem is still ultimately connected to its own mitzias. In other words, it's the nature of the neshama to be connected to Hashem. And therefore, even though the connection, the iskashas, is with such great strength that it's going to be standing strong even as it's clothed in the guf, in the nefesh habahamis, even while it's doing all the mundane things, etc. But nevertheless, since it's part of the teva of the mitzias of the nefesh olikis, there is still a certain limitation. However, when the neshama comes along and makes it the world should be a keli for elikus, since this idea that the world should be a keli to elikus is not coming from the teva, from the nature or from the mitzias of the world. On the contrary, the world, oilam is melashon helam, from the from oilam it means concealment. It's concealing ungodliness. So where does it come from such a thing that even the world could become a keli to elikus? That's coming from the fact That's coming from the Eibishter. That's not coming mitzad the koyach of the neshama itself or the world itself. That's coming from the fact that the achdus of the Eibishter, the oneness of Hashem, has absolutely no limitations, and therefore even the world could become a place for Hashem. So when the neshama now goes ahead and makes the world a place for Hashem, and in that way is bringing out the bligvul, the achdus of Hashem, then its iskashrus to the Eibishter now becomes not only based on the qualities of the neshama itself, the characteristics of the neshama itself, the limitations of the neshama itself, but rather it's now coming mitzad, the achdus of Hashem, that's completely bligvul. In other words, now the neshama tapped in to the absolute infinity of Hashem himself. Now the Rebbe takes it a step further. All of these aliyahs to which the neshama comes through its yerida lamata are still not the ultimate purpose of why it came down. Because since everything that Hashem created in this world, loy broi elu lechvoide, is ultimately only for Hashem's glory, and ani nivreisi l'shamashes koine yiyid is only here to serve Hashem. So it's understood that the ultimate goal of why a person is created and why the neshama came down is not for the aliyah of the neshama, but only to carry out Hashem's kavanah. The Rebbe says this is similar to what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that the Yeridus HaNeshama Lamata was not for the sake of the neshama. It's only in order to transform the guf, the nefesh hachiyun, is the portion in the world, to connect them with Eirin Soif Baruch Hu. And through that we carry out the purpose of Hashem's kavanah of Nis'ava HaKadosh Baruch Hu liyis lo yidira b'tachtoinim. It is only that since the neshama is the one that brings about Hashem's kavanah practically, so therefore it obviously also deserves reward and unlimited reward, and therefore it also has this most amazing infinite aliyah. But again, this is not the ultimate goal and purpose. So the Rebbe says, so we need to understand, how does this fit, now that we're saying that it's only for Hashem's kavanah, how does this fit with the fact that it does say in many places that the Yeridus HaNeshama Lamata is for the purpose of aliyah, which sounds like that the aliyah HaNeshama, the fact that the neshama has an aliyah, is not just a side point, a byproduct, that it also ends up getting rewarded. It sounds like that is the purpose of the Yerida. So how do we understand this? How does this fit with what we just said, that the purpose is only dira b'tachtoinim? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, or at least very briefly, the Rebbe says, b'ktsor al koponim. It's known that the concept of dira lo yisbarach b'tachtoinim is that only and specifically tachtoinim become the dira for Hashem, for the very essence of Hashem. In the upper worlds, what shines is only giluyim, is only what we call a revelation, but not the etzem of Hashem. In the tachtoinim, they are the ones that become the place for the very, very essence of Hashem. Says the Rebbe, this idea that Atzmus finds itself specifically down here is connected with the fact that it's specifically in this world where we have the bitul, which is called ein oid, as opposed to the olam Yisrael yoinim, where the bitul over there is just what's called killah. Now the Rebbe does not go into it over here, but briefly, looking up to my Morim that the Rebbe references, so the general idea, in the way I understand it is that in the olam Yisrael yoinim, we say kula kamei killah choshiv. The olam Yisrael yoinim are usually associated with what we call oiros and giluyim, lights, revelations, energies, and so on. And we say that they are killah, that they are like nothing in compared to the source and compared to Hashem. So there's a bitul, but it's not there. It's not non-existent. It's killah choshev. It's considered like nothing. In this world, which is a world of yeshus, a world that's yesh me'ayin, this world has absolutely no existence whatsoever other than the koyach of Hashem constantly creating it the whole time. So it's dafka, this world, that has a true bittul, that's really, truly nothing. Einoid, that there's nothing besides for Hashem. So I think that's what the Rebbe is referring to over here, that it's specifically in this world that has that absolute bittul. Although, of course, we unfortunately don't usually feel it. But the real bittul is specifically in this world. Now back to the Sicha. Says the Rebbe, since the kavanah is that the dira should be accomplished through the avodah Adam specifically, so therefore also in the Yid's avodah, through which the dira is being accomplished, there also needs to be this idea of absolute bittul. The kind of bittul that is similar to that bittul that we just mentioned, einoid. What is that bittul? That's the bittul of like a simple servant, the evet pashut, which is not even coming because he feels the greatness of the master and so on, but it's purely just coming from the master himself. It's the only thing that counts as the master. It's not about the servant at all. He's completely bottled. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand why in a number of places it says that the Yeridus HaNeshama Lamata is for the Aliyah, and how that's connected with what it says in Tanya, that the purpose of the Neshama coming down here is to fulfill the idea of Dira B'Tachtoinim. So now we can understand it, says the Rebbe. Because when we speak about Yeridut Tzorech Aliyah, what is the Aliyah of the Neshama? The greatest Aliyah is when it comes to this absolute bittul. What is the bittul? Like we said earlier in the Sicha, it's that the avodah is not because of its mitzias, the iskashus is not because of its existence, because it naturally wants to be connected to Hashem, but it's much more than that. We said it makes the Dira B'Tachtoinim is revealing the achdus of Hashem in the world. And so that's the greatest aliyah, is that it comes, that the neshama taps into this idea of Hashem just because of Hashem, not because of itself. Says the Rebbe, so in the idea of Dira B'Tachtoinim, what's important over here is that the avodas HaNeshama, in making this dira, should be with this absolute bittul. So really the idea of dira b'tachtoinim and the aliyah of the neshama really are very much one and the same thing. Says the Rebbe, now we can go back and understand the different aspects in the psukim of Yaakov's vow. And as we explained, it could really be divided into 4 points. 2 of them we said is in the condition, and 2 of them in the vow itself. Says the Rebbe, both ideas of the condition. Now the 2 ideas are, in the condition we said, number 1, Hashem is going to be with me, Yishmarani, he's going to protect me, and he's going to give me bread to eat and clothes to wear. That was in the first pasuk. The next pasuk where it said, V'shavti b'shalom el beis avi, I'm going to return in peace to my father's house. So, and they are, as we said before, in 2 psukim, which tell us that it's 2 different categories. So those are the 2 parts of the condition. Now the Rebbe in the meantime is learning like the Ramban. The Rebbe is soon going to go to Rashi. And both ideas of the neder, according to the Ramban, which starts off with 2 points. First of all, V'hoya Hashem li lelikim, that Hashem will be my Eibishter. And V'o'even hazois asher samti matzeva, that this stone that I've placed as a monument, Yebeis elikim, which are again in 2 psukim. We can now understand this division and what's going on. What are these 4 details? The Rebbe says, as we said in the beginning of the Sicha, the whole point is the neder, it's not the condition. The whole point is to be able to fulfill the vow. The condition was only how I'm going to get to the vow. That's what we said before. So now, when we explained how it works with Yeridus HaNeshama in this world, so now, says the Rebbe, we can understand what the Psukim are speaking about is that the whole purpose of the Yeridus HaNeshama, what's the goal? What's the purpose? There's 2 points. Number 1, we said, there's the Aliyas HaNeshama itself, the Neshama being elevated to a very, very high level. But then even more than that, the ultimate is to achieve the Dira B'Tachtoinim. And just like there is these 2 ideas in the ultimate purpose, so too in the avodah that's going to bring to it, there's also 2 general ideas. There's the avodah of Torah and mitzvahs, and there's the avodah of Kol Masechel L'Shem Shamayim. So therefore, we're going to now see that the 2 ideas of the Tanai that Yaakov Avinu makes, those 2 psukim, are really connected to these 2 types of avodah. The first pasuk says, Hashem is going to be with me, Yishmarani, he's going to protect me, he's going to give me bread to eat and clothes to wear. This is that Hashem is going to help me to be able to do my avodah. First of all, in Sur Meira, Hashem is going to be with me, Yishmarani, he's going to protect me from Averos. He's going to help me to be able to do my Asay Toiv, learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, which that's in the pasuk. He's going to give me bread to eat. And as we know, bread is compared to Torah is compared to bread, and beged is the idea of mitzvahs. So that's one pasuk. The next pasuk says, and this is again still part of the avodah, still part of the condition. If I manage to do this, the next pasuk is v'shavti b'shalom, I'll come home in peace. This is the avodah of divrei harishus, the avodah of kol masechel l'shem shamayim. This is similar to the idea of tshuva, v'shavti. This is more like dealing with those things of the mundane things. That is, what's v'shavti b'shalom, that although I'm going to be dealing with regular worldly things, divrei harishus, and why I'm dealing with them is because these are things that coming from the nefesh habahamis. These are things the nefesh habahamis needs and wants, and nevertheless, these are not going to pull me down into the ra. Rather, I'll come up. Shalei menachet. I'm not going to learn from Lavan's ways, because I'm not going to be doing them just for the taiva. I'm going to be doing it l'shem shamayim. So these are the 2 parts in the avodah, or in the condition. So these 2 avodos are now going to bring to the two results in the neder. In other words, the purpose of why the neshama is coming down. Number one, Hashem is going to be Maya B'Shter. In other words, that's the aliyah of the neshama. That's the person becoming closer and connected to Hashem. And then there's the ultimate. The stone will be a house for Hashem, which is the idea of making the world a dira for Hashem, a dira lo yisbarach b'tachtonim. Now, says the Rebbe, since we know that the main aliyah of the neshama, as we said, is really about going out of its metzius and serving Hashem, not only because of its own teva, but because of Hashem, because Hashem is all over, and also in the worldly things, even things that are not godliness. Therefore, the order of the pasuk is, V'hoya Hashem lilei loikim. Again, we're explaining according to the Ramban, that we said it's really part of the previous pasuk. Sorry, V'hoya Hashem lilei loikim is then going to follow into V'evan azoisi beis elikim, as the Ramban says. Well, how did the Ramban explain the connection between these two things? That I'm going to serve Hashem in the place of this stone that's going to be a house for Hashem. In other words, that his avodah is going to be, in his avodah it's going to be sensed, it's going to be felt, that it's not coming just because of my own nature, but rather in my avodah itself it's going to be felt, that Evan Azois that's going to be a Beis Elikim. In other words, that the stone, why can it be a Beis Elikim? It's coming because of the Achdus of Hashem, which is Bli Gvul. And nevertheless, says the Rebbe, where is V'hoya Avaya Lilei Elikim? It's not in the same pasuk as V'evan Azois, rather it's in the previous pasuk, as we said, with V'shavti B'shalim. Why is that? Because since the ultimate purpose of the Yeridas HaNeshama down here is not for the Aliyah of the Neshama, as we said, but really it's about fulfilling the Kavanah of Dira B'tachtoinim. This is why V'hoya Hashem Lilei Elikim, even though, yes, it is already the result after the Avodah. Seemingly it should be part of the next pasuk, together with V'evan Azois. But nevertheless, in a certain detail, it's still connected with the previous pasuk. In other words, because it's still not the ultimate purpose. It's still more connected to the Tanai, to the condition, to the Avodah. It's more connected to V'shavti B'shalim than to the ultimate purpose of the Dira B'tachtoinim, which is V'evan Azois, Yiyeh Beis Elikim. Now that's according to the Ramban. What about Rashi? Says the Rebbe V'yesh Loimar, that also according to Rashi, that V'hoya Hashem lilei elikim is not the neder, is not what he's promising is going to be, but rather the condition. Says the Rebbe, even according to Rashi, V'hoya Hashem lilei elikim is a detail, not only in the avodah of the neshama, but it's also part of the aliyah as that's being accomplished through the avodah, similar to the Ramban. Because, how did Rashi explain V'hoya Hashem lilei elikim? Sheyachol shmoy olai, that Hashem's name will apply to me from the beginning to the end, to my descendants. There won't be any psul in my children. In other words, that Hashem's name is going to be not only in the beginning parts, but even in the end parts, even the things that come out of Yaakov, etc. How could that be? How could that keep on going on and on? That Hashem's name is connected to Yaakov. It's only because it's iskashos to the Eibishters in a way that it's without any conditions. So in a certain extent, this is also already speaking about the result of Avodah, an outcome of Avodah. And the fact that according to Rashi, it's being put in as part of the Tanai, part of the condition, not as part of the result, according to the Neder, that's not part of what he's saying is going to happen, not the result, not the Neder, is because the Aliyah of the Neshama is ultimately only a preparation for V'evan Azois Yiyeh Beis Elikim Dira B'tachtoinim, and therefore it's still part of, even though it's already to a certain extent some sort of reward, but it's still part of only the hachana for the ultimate of Dira B'tachtoinim. Concludes the Rebbe, V'yesh loimar, that the reason why, according to Rashi, V'hoya Hashem lilei elikim is a part of the condition, part of the preparation, and according to the Ramban, this is already part of the result, part of the neder. Says the Rebbe, because in Pirush Ramban there isn't only Pshut Shel Mikra. There's also Dvorim Ne'imim L'Yodechein. The Ramban himself says there's all sorts of other things that are more on the level of Kabbalah, etc. In other words, levels that are more connected with Geshmaka things, Giluyim, etc. And on the level of Giluyim, yes, the fact that the Neshama is having an Aliyah is also a certain goal and a purpose. However, according to Rashi, who is Pshutay Shel Mikra, which in Avodah Adam, this is the idea of Avodah of an Eved Pashat, a simple servant, who's not looking for any benefits, for any Aliyos. All he wants is just the Ratzon Ha'adain, and this is why, even these greatest aliyahs, Vaya Hashem Lila Lekim, is still part of the hachana, and the ultimate is only the idea of Dira B'Tachtoinim.